It is. It always is, and it always most certainly is an inconvenience being evicted. I know, and we were. Alice did not like it, Alice Stokely, and she said so. She said, who are you to be telling us that our home today is to be someone else's home tomorrow? And he said, I am the landlord, madam. That is who I am. And he was, and he is, and we are evicted. And that, as they say, is that. And tomorrow the landlord's son moves in. Just because he is getting married, tomorrow the landlord's son moves in. Well, anyway. Before I came to be living here, I was going to be not being living there. There is in America, of course, naturally it is. And I wanted to be going away, not to be coming back again until I was a lion. A real lion. Sometimes only in exile can one truly represent one's country. That was true of Dante, and it is true of me. Which reminds me of eviction and packing, and I do not want to be reminded of packing. I hate packing. So I'll be reminded of something else. Immediately, Picasso comes to mind. But before I'm reminded of Picasso, I must be reminded of Alice Stokely, who is at the present moment sound asleep in her room. Alice asked me to wake her in 3 hours. If it stops raining, she said. Well, it has now been 6 hours, and it is still raining. I do not know what to do. Well, Alice knows not to trust me with a task. Tasks are things I cannot do. They make me nervous. Oh, I can drive a car and walk around and talk simply and straightforwardly. And I can write, of course, and read and eat food. But anything beyond that makes me nervous. The most difficult part about being a genius is you have to sit around all the time doing absolutely nothing. You just do. Alice. She will want to be packing things. Oh, dear. And that reminds me of moving. I would rather be reminded of the day that I moved in. Yes, it is more pleasant, much more. Leo was there, of course. Leo Stein, my brother, who was 2 years older than I. It was originally his pavilion. By that, I mean he found it and lived here alone for a time. And then I came to 27 Rue de Fleureuse, and all who followed after that. But that will all come much later. Leo was, at that time, an art enthusiast. A quattrocento art enthusiast. Quattrocento art being his forte and the subject of his studies and the object of his fleeting passions. How he loved the Italian. It is always best being the youngest in the family. I was. And it is best, it just is. Everyone watches out after you, and that saves you a lot of bother. Of course, when you grow up, then you remain a child. And that is both good and bad. Anyway, that is the way that it was. I had just arrived, and Leo looked after me, and it was all very interesting. The weather was nice, and we walked everywhere immediately. Paris had not changed considerably since I was 3. It still smelled of leather and perfume. And that was nice. But Leo was troubled because he had just reached a dead end with Leonardo da Vinci, trying to comprehend his mind. So we touched on genius, though nothing really got said, except that another enthusiasm seemed to be replacing his already famous one for quattrocento art, and that was actually painting. With paint. He had already talked himself out of devoting his intellectual life to the pursuits of biology, aesthetics, philosophy, and history, and now evidently it was to be so with quattrocento art. And did I think so? Well, I said, anything is a walk, a stroll in the park is a walk, but this is a conversation. So I said, you have a habit of draining out your energies in analysis and conversation. And he did. And he did not like that at all, so we talked about other things and walked everywhere immediately. And he told me about his talks with Pablo Casals and how they discussed art weekly over dinner, which had made him want to try his own hand at painting. Leo. So he rushed home, built a fire in the stove, took off all of his clothes, and began making sketches from the nude. Although he never said what Casals did that night. I suppose he played his cello. Well, later, we met his friends, the Berensons, Bernard and his wife, and we dined. They played a game where they selected a photograph of a painting, and then they covered it with a tablecloth that had a small hole in it. And once they had done this, they would proceed to try to guess from some small detail of the painting who the artist was. Well, Berenson was an authority. But Leo often guessed correctly, especially if the artist was a quattrocento one. I seldom ever knew, but I laughed a lot. In fact, it was one night while playing that game that Bernard Berenson said to Leo, perhaps if you cannot be a great painter, you will be a great collector then. And Leo agreed. So the next day we combed the galleries and shops of Paris trying to find something new, but we were disappointed. And Berenson said, have you ever heard of Cézanne? And we said we had not. Where does one find him? And he said at Volar's. Volar's on the Rue Lafitte. So, the next day, Leo and I went to Anway's Volar's tiny little shop on the Rue Lafitte. In the doorway of the tiny shop stood a huge, dark man peering ominously into the street. That was Volar. Cheerful. He was himself a collector extraordinaire. He'd been so always. When he was little, he collected rocks from his mother's garden. It pleased him greatly then, and it pleased him greatly now to be collecting the first of those pieces of art that separated the 20th century from the 19th century, and which utterly shocked Paris in those days. Although I must confess, I did not take to them immediately. Though Leo did. Leo did. But first, entering the shop was a thing unto itself. Once we had crossed the threshold, Leo and I found ourselves in a store that could easily have been mistaken for a junk shop. Everything was covered with at least one layer of dust, and for a minute we were afraid to move lest we disturb some structure that had been in progress for centuries. Anyway, Leo said something. The Cézannes? We want to see the Cézannes? Ah, muttered Volar, and then he disappeared upstairs. Well, my brother and I waited anxiously And he was gone a long time, and he was gone a longer time. And then we heard footsteps down the stairs. And when Vollard returned, he was carrying a painting of an apple. And we said no. And then he disappeared again, and Leo called after him, "A landscape!" And when Vollard returned, he was carrying a painting of a nude. But it was a Cézanne. But we were not yet ready for Cézanne nudes, so I said, "Yes, but we wanted a landscape. A sunny one?" And Leo said, "Preferably not unfinished." And Vollard mumbled something under his breath, and then he disappeared again upstairs. Well, it grew dark outside, and we waited. And then we heard the footsteps down the stairs. But this time, it was an old charwoman who emerged from the stairway, and she looked at us, and then she went quietly out the front door. Then more footsteps down the stairs, and another old charwoman emerged and did the same thing. So I finally said, "The truth is, there really is no Cézanne. These old women do it all in the attic." And then Vollard reappeared. He was carrying a landscape this time. A green Cézanne landscape. Green, green. And we liked it. We both did. And we conferred, and then we bought it. Little did we realize that we had just taken the first step toward planting ourselves in the center of an art movement, the likes of which the outside world had never known. Now that is what they call the art of building suspense. And I really ought to wake Alice up now, I really should. But she so dislikes a rainy day. It makes her melancholy. She is like that, and I'm not. Sometimes it is nice just to sit and listen to the rain and make the past the present. And that is what art is. Making the past the present and making the present a continuous one. A portrait of the autumn exhibition in Paris when I was 29 by Gertrude. Gertrude Stein. A building, a line up to the door, a crowd around the painting inside, and whispers, not without malice whispers. What is it? What is what? What is that? What is that? A painting of a lady with a hat, oh. What is that line of green on her nose, Well, on her nose green was seen, I suppose. Really, do you think so? Never mind. And another voice said, nastiest smear of paint I ever laid eyes on. Really, do you think so? I thought I told you. What a fine gathering. And then another voice said, who is responsible for this outrage? To which Matisse replied, I am. And then he left. Well, one could hardly blame him. It was a portrait of his wife. Leo did not like the painting either. Naturally, of course, I did. So we bought it. The new Matisse looked lovely beside the green Cézanne landscape. The Cézanne nudes, they were inevitable. But it did, the Matisse, make a little argument when placed next to the black and white by Manet. And we knew enough not to group it with the two Renoirs. They were so small it would have eaten them up completely, entirely. But all in all, the art wall was beginning to be a beginning. And even after we added a pair of medium-sized Gauguins, it was the lady with the hat, the Marquise, who remained the jewel that stood out from among all the rest. Leo was pleased with himself and pleased with the world at large, just knowing that one did not have to be a millionaire in order to own an oil. As for me, I was pleased because it was by the light of those paintings that I first began to write. But first, it is often true in the 29th year of one's life, when one is 29, that all of the wild energies that are thrown off by the creative process of the making of a personality begin to take form and shape. This one may be pointed like an arrow. That one may be branched out like that. This one may be circular. But it is often true in the 29th year, whether really or metaphorically, that these energies begin to assume a decided shape. And one is confronted with the question of one's purpose. And life, which was all a blurry splash of color, begins to narrow down to an acutely focused arrangement of patterns. I wonder if that was clear. Well, no doubt I will continue doing it. And so, in that 29th year, one is usually forced or obliged or inspired to make a choice about one's inner life, whether to acknowledge and express or obscure as best as possible that inner life. Now then, when Leo and I were growing up together in California, and our family being the way that it was, we knew nothing about one another's inner lives. Not a thing. But it is that inner life, it is that one, it is that thing that is the actual life of any individual. And we knew nothing about one another's actual lives because no one in the family had the vision it takes to see an inner life, much less the skillful audacity required to share one. We talked about it years later, Leo and I, when we were in Paris, but we never talked about it then. We were too young and our inner lives were kept secret. But later, years later, when Leo underwent psychoanalysis, he blamed this necessity to keep his inner life secret on the American middle-class habit of discouraging self-expression. Well, Leo thought a lot, but I tend to disagree. I think it was because our parents were a bore, a real bore. They had planned on 5 children, and they had planned their little lives for them in advance of their birth. But the 2 youngest died in their infancy and were immediately replaced by Leo and me. In that order. Well, it makes one feel queer to think about being born under such circumstances. Makes one feel funny, it just does. So we rarely thought about it. But when we did, it made us question the purpose behind life. And so, by my 29th year, haunted all the while by that fact, I finally decided to devote myself to writing. Leo was immediately skeptical. No doubt it stemmed from envy because he had not yet reached the 29th year of his life, and he was already well into his 30s. But whether or not he had a theme, Leo, he had a definite flair for explaining things, and he had a definite need to be explaining them, because by and by, as people began to drop over to see the paintings, the Cézannes and Matisses and Gauguins, he would explain to them whatever he felt needed to be explained at the time, which was usually his expert, if not somewhat tortured, analysis of modern art. And thus began the Saturday evenings at 27 Rue de Fleurus. It was of necessity that we became formal about it. People were coming and going and coming back again with more people. Some we knew, some we did not. It was all very interesting. But it was becoming a nuisance, particularly because I had just begun devoting myself to writing. I was writing a book called 3 Lives, in which I wished to achieve the same effect in literature as was achieved by Cézanne and Matisse in their painting, in regard to total impression and the portrayal of character through the use of unorthodox colors and textures. And I wanted to accomplish that. And I wanted to accomplish that in literature. To do with words what they did with paint. To use a new metaphor in writing that up until that time had been exclusive to painting. And I did it. And I did it by the light of the paintings, and it worked, and I called it 3 Lives. But it was not to be written with people coming and going at all hours, so the Saturday evenings evolved out of necessity, and usually only after 9 o'clock. It was then my habit to begin writing about 11 o'clock, because I like 11 o'clock, and because there was rarely a knock on the door at that time. So I would begin writing about then and write until dawn. Sentences and words are a passion. They do not just happen, they evolve gradually, and that usually takes until dawn. Then I would go to bed and sleep until noon, to be awakened by the sound of beating of rugs in the courtyard, which was as disagreeable as it was effective. But Eline, the housekeeper, had her own set of passions. For example, she did not care for Matisse. Her omelets and soufflés were her speciality. But for Matisse, she always fried the eggs. It requires the same amount of eggs and butter, she would say, but it lacks respect. Everyone is a critic. But Eline was an excellent housekeeper, too. And she always cooked and cleaned for us, especially on Saturday night, when everybody came and brought somebody. The group would usually arrive about 9 o'clock, and I would greet them at the door. And then I would show them into the studio, where Leo was frequently to be found lying on the floor with his feet propped up and supported by a bookcase. It is good for the indigestion, he would say. And an exotic cure was always a thing of joy to Leo, even if there was no exotic ailment for it to act upon. Isadora came and brought somebody. Isadora Duncan with the scarves. Oh, and if Leo loved the Italian, she loved the Greek even more. Anything that was below the Greek was below the Greek. Isadora was like that. She and Raymond was her brother. She and Raymond Duncan grew up in San Francisco, too. And now they live just down the block from us on the Rue de Fleurus. They had just returned from Greece, the Duncans. And now they were Greek. They were not going to be Italian Renaissance anymore. And even that was better than their Omar Khayyam stage. Well, anyway, one night, Isadora danced a little. She always did. And Raymond looked at the paintings. He announced that since he'd become a Greek, his taste in art was now perfect. And he found the paintings ugly. So we showed the Duncans out and did not ask them back. Although later, years later, we were saddened to learn that Isadora Duncan with the scarves had gotten one of them caught in the spokes of the wheels of someone's convertible going 45 miles an hour and died instantly. Sad. But still, affectations can be dangerous. As Leo pointed out, he, and not the paintings, ultimately became the point of interest and attraction at the Saturday evenings. It was Leo's personality and presence that created the reputation of the Stein salon at that time, when many of the artists and writers that we'd met at the cafes came to take tea and to match intellects with Leo on the subject of modern art, while I sat in my armchair quietly listening. Yes, quietly. Some thought him obnoxious, others charming. But whatever he was impressive, Leo. And for Paris then and for modern art, he was a vital force. And when he was not expounding his theories or improving his ingestion, he was singing and dancing. And one woman told him that his imitation of Isadora Duncan was too sensitive to be satire. He thanked her. He was not without his charm. She was also the same person who told me that I did not look ladylike while smoking a cigar. I thanked her, too. Upon exhaling. Well, all in all, everyone who came by to see the paintings was, in one way or another, impressed. Especially by Cézanne and Matisse. But the artist, the painting that was to become the largest part of me and of my life, was a portrait of myself as yet unpainted by a young and almost completely unknown artist, a Spaniard. Which finally brings me to the subject of Picasso. Pablo Picasso.
From the sanctuary of a cloistered church in Austria, a special recital by the celebrated Russian pianist Emil Gilels. The drama of Russian Romanticism finds poetic expression in this brilliant performance. His interpretation of Mozart, an outpouring of heartfelt song. And Beethoven's heroic Waldstein Sonata, a triumph in technical mastery. One of the first to emerge beyond the Iron Curtain, the artistry of Emil Gilels transcends the boundaries of time and place. Emil Gilels, tomorrow on CBS Cable.
Genius is to me the rarest of human qualities. It is the art of becoming legendary. I've always adored legends, and I've always admired geniuses who get themselves into them. But with art, it is a funny thing. Which is the more important, the artist or the art? Well, whichever one you start with, it always leads to the other. Picasso was his paintings, and his paintings were Picasso, and everyone who knew him knew that. Picasso was discovered by me, according to me. And he was discovered by Leo, according to Leo. And so we argued. It was finally decided that Leo could be the discoverer of Picasso's works in Paris, if I could be the discoverer of the man himself. And that is how history resolves a conflict. And we were both pleased then, according to Picasso. I wonder if Alice is going to sleep forever. Well, he lived in a little place at that time, Picasso, called the Bateau Lavoir. It was called that because it was near the Seine and looked like the laundry barges that floated down it. It was a double-irony Bateau Lavoir because the building only had one faucet. This he shared with the poet Max Jacob and a very lively person by the name of Fernand Olivier. I must go on about Fernand a bit. She was called La Belle Fernand because of her charm and spirit. She had escaped from an early marriage and a life in the provinces into the extraordinary world of the struggling artists and writers who lived in the Latin Quarter in Paris at that time. And she and Picasso had tormented each other lovingly for more than 12 years. She'd seen him through his blue period, the rose period, the harlequin period. And now she watched as his work began absorbing the influence of the African art that was his Spanish heritage, becoming more and more geometrical and freeing itself from the limitations of realism. It excited her. She was no fool. But she wore hats a lot. And I have often found that women who like to wear hats a lot are usually, well, anyway. Picasso now was a more intense individual. A quiet one. Some thought him remote. He was not. Nor was he intimate. He was just totally there, always. He carried his head like a priceless bust, like a bullfighter's. His shoulders held a certain way, and his eyes were dark, which is always dramatic. And they drank up everything they saw. Leo said his gaze was so absorbing, Picasso's, that whenever he looked at a picture, one was surprised to find anything left on the paper afterwards. Leo was particularly taken with a painting by Picasso of a young girl carrying a basket of flowers with the legs and feet of a monkey. I hated it. We knew her. She had nice feet. She sold flowers outside the Moulin Rouge. And to me, it was not her, the painting. So we left the cafe without buying the painting, arguing. Then the next night at dinner, Leo told me he'd gone ahead and purchased it. Well, I threw my napkin down. My appetite was ruined. But if Picasso's paintings did not immediately captivate my interest, the man who painted them did. So, by and by, as he and Fernand began to show up at the Stein salon to see the paintings, his, hanging beside Cézanne's, Matisse's, Renoir's, and Gauguin's. They brought the gang with them. The poets and the painters from the Latin Quarter, many of whom had followed Picasso all the way from Barcelona. Yes, it really was a movement, and it was beginning to be getting big. Now, Max Jacob, whom they brought with them, was not just a poet. He told fortunes, and as they say, he was the life of every party. And then Apollinaire began to show up. Guillaume Apollinaire was another friend of Picasso's and a poet too, but Probably of all the regulars who came at that time, he was the most loved. He had a habit of holding his lips like this to give bite to whatever he said. You have such skinny fingers, he would say to Marie Laurencin with his lips like this. You have such skinny... Well, Marie Laurencin and Guillaume Apollinaire were lovers in those days, and at that time, Fernand was La Belle Fernande, Picasso was Pablo, I was Gertrude, Mademoiselle Gertrude, Max was Max, and Apollinaire was Guillaume. But Marie Laurencin was always Marie Laurencin. She is still Marie Laurencin. She was a painter, Marie Laurencin, the only woman painter in the movement, and very strange. She did a portrait of Picasso, Fernand, Apollinaire, and herself. And it was very strange. I bought it from her. She had never sold one before, and Apollinaire was so pleased that he wrote a little pamphlet about the movement in which he referred to it as Cubist. He was the first one ever to do that. And everyone then was pleased, especially Marie Laurencin, who was now being exhibited beside Picasso and Matisse. In the midst of all of that, there was Picasso. Always totally Picasso. Watching and listening and thinking Spanish thoughts. He was busily engaged in creating the 20th century in those days. And his mind was anywhere but at a party when he was at a party. But one night, he leaned over and whispered quietly in my ear, "You will see for a portrait now?" And I said, "By you?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "You betcha." Well, he'd not worked with a model in over 8 years, Picasso, and then only once. So I went to his studio to pose, and there followed some 90 sittings. Sometimes at these sittings, Fernand would fix tea, and Picasso would discuss his ideas, especially those concerned with Cubism. You start with an object, he would say. Then you strip all traces of reality away from it. There is nothing to fear because the idea of the object will continue to remain present. And it is the idea, not the object, that is important. Well, he was talking about painting, of course, but his ideas were pertinent to my thoughts on literature at that time. To start with an object, then to strip all traces of reality away from it to be left only with the idea to be perceived. And that is what I did with some of the characters in Three Lives, and I have Picasso's genius to thank for it. When he was little, his mother said if he became a soldier, he would be a general. If he became a priest, he would be the Pope. Instead, he became an artist and ended up as Picasso. But he was a warm man, and a simple one. And those sittings, like the long walks across the Seine, became a source of inspiration to me. And we became great friends, Picasso and I. We were alike in many ways. And then, one day, suddenly, without warning, he dipped a cloth in turpentine and wiped my face right off the canvas. "I cannot see you anymore," he said. And that was the end of the sittings. Well, he went to Spain and back again before he painted in the face, this time without a model. And it looked like a mask, an African one. The eyes were sort of almond-shaped, almost larger than the other. Oh, I loved it immediately. Everyone else was merely astonished. But she does not look like that, someone said. She will, he said. Well, while he was there in Spain, I finished the book I was writing, but it was written in pencil and difficult to read. And unfortunately, typing is one of the things that makes me nervous. So Etta Cohn took pity. Miss Etta Cohn, one of my oldest friends from Baltimore. And she offered to type the manuscript for me. She and her sister Clarabelle used to visit me while I was posing for Picasso. And Picasso persuaded them to buy the complete collection of his more obscure sketches. In other words, the discards. They were nothing more than litter to him. But the Cohn sisters did not know that. They thought it was some valuable esoteric collection. So they paid Picasso something like $2 apiece for the sketches. And Picasso went away happy because he always enjoyed taking Americans for a ride. And the Cohn sisters went away happy, too, because their complete collection of Picassos was to become the heart of the Baltimore Museum of Art. Wonderful, wonderful. Well, after Miss Etta finished typing the manuscript of the book, we sent it to a friend in New York, and he submitted it to a publisher, and it was rejected, immediately rejected. It is an enormous thing, rejection. It makes one feel funny. I did. So I automatically turned to my brother for encouragement. Mistake. Once he had read the book, which he did not want to do. He was silent, non-committal, painfully so. He was beginning to lose the little patience he had with people, Leo. He was beginning to be going deaf. Going what? Going deaf. Yes, it is. Thank you very much. He had also just given up on Cubism at that time. He said he could no longer take it seriously. He said he knew its origins too well and considered them ludicrous. For all of his energies and efforts put forth on the behalf of modern art, he was to secede from the movement at that point and to be left behind utterly by this revolution in art. He had been the most effective and impressive connoisseur of this art in the world, in the entire world. He had recognized Picasso and Matisse, not just one or the other, as everybody else had, but that they were related in certain ways that they were not even aware of, Picasso and Matisse. And this relationship was visible only to him, Leo. And it was important to him then, too. And it was important to the world. And now he was even going to turn his back on Matisse. Not just Picasso, but Matisse. And the whole thing with Cubism. For Leo, the portrait of me by Picasso was as a whole incoherent. And that is when my conversations with Picasso began to grow. And my dialogues with Leo began to diminish. Picasso said at that time, and I agreed, that ugliness and the confrontation of ugliness in art was beginning to unsettle people's pictures of life just a bit. Their definition of ugliness was beginning to grow vague. And unlike Leo, I was not interested in the principles of art. It was his interest in them that had held him back. Oh, one was always aware with Leo's creations of his meticulously studied techniques. Oh, there can be no doubt about that. But he always quit. Always gave in before he was through, before he achieved that feeling. Because in the end, he was afraid that it might not be there. And that is generally the case with quattrocento art experts who know so much about how a painting is painted that they misplace the ability to comprehend why. A child with a piece of chalk and a blackboard is a potential Sistine Chapel in a way. The cavemen did it on the walls in their caves, and although it was not Rembrandt, it was art. Theirs was art. Now that is not nonsense. Anyone can criticize, but not everyone can do. As was the case with Mr. Leo. And if his tastes were beginning to revert back to the conservative, mine were not. I was continuing to be moving ahead. I'd already planned my next book, my 1,000-page book. It was to be called The Making of Americans. It was to have no beginning, no middle, and no end. Just a continuous flow of repeated words and phrases with gradual variations. In other words, sheer cubism. But Picasso did not understand. He did not think that could be accomplished in literature. So he asked Leo about it. Leo was silent naturally. He could not be bothered. He had just figured out the secret of what makes a sonnet tick. And so, Picasso was left out in the dark, and I had no one with whom to discuss this head full of ideas I was carrying around with this 1,000-page book. Absolutely no one. And then the San Francisco earthquake happened, which changed my life.
In the great tradition of British explorers, from Livingstone to Sir Francis Drake, comes an even more daring original.
Got ya!
More dogged than Superman, more eccentric than Tarzan is David Bellamy, the Botanic Man.
All I need is a penknife, and there she flows.
Bellamy's backyard is the planet Earth, and if you tag along, he'll show you what your neighborhood was like 1 billion years ago.
All the happenings in evolution, I reckon this comes closest to a miracle.
David Bellamy proves that the secrets of man's destiny can be found anywhere, from the bottom of the sea to the eyes of a creature hiding in a forgotten nest.
The bird in question's the pink pigeon, and today there are only 30 of them left.
It takes a rare bird to know one, and that's David Bellamy. Humanist, conservationist, environmentalist, and a thoroughly botanic man. Thursday nights on CBS Cable.
Is there any relationship more complex, more puzzling than that between a man and a woman? Perhaps one between two men and the woman who must choose between them.
Nearly had my eye out.
Tom Conti as Patrick, a gentle, reasonable man, not particularly well coordinated.
I'm telling you again, it's relevant, isn't it?
Yes, I know. I'm not saying...
Or
you
well
told me
spoken.
I don't want to hear about it. I'm saying you told me and I know about it. I can understand why you said it.
John Hurt as Dave, not too gentle, but very well spoken.
I live on my wits and try to cover all the exits.
You don't even have to speak to me. But you actually appear to be living with a man who's been a household joke for 2 years.
A man of passion and of pain.
Please.
Kate Nelligan as the woman who may decide to have neither of them. A play as intricate as a Chinese puzzle. Treats lays out all the pieces, Tuesday on CBS Cable.
The San Francisco earthquake, which changed my life. was I? Oh, San Francisco. Now, Michael Stein and his wife Sally were living in Paris at the time of the San Francisco earthquake. Michael, dear Michael, who had financially supported Leo and me all the time we lived in Paris. Michael was the eldest of my brothers, as Leo was the youngest. Simon and Bertha were in the middle. He was simple, and she had a habit of grinding her teeth at night. But, to stick to the subject, Michael and Sally Stein frantically returned to San Francisco after news of the disaster to survey any damage that might have been wrought on their home or the family business. And they took with them several new Matisses, which were the first of their kind to be seen in America. And that is how the new movement spread across the ocean. San Francisco was a total wreck when they got there. Only the frame structures had withstood the earthquake because they were flexible. So nature had provided us all with a little lesson. One must be flexible if one is to survive. Michael and Sally were flexible, and their house was flexible too, and so was the family business, fortunately. So, before Michael and Sally Stein returned to Paris, they showed their new Matisses to their neighbor, Harriet Levy, and she told her next-door neighbor about them. Now, the next-door neighbor was a real character, a paradox. She liked a view, she said, but she liked to sit with her back to it. That was the next-door neighbor. She had plans to be a concert pianist. She had studied under a pupil of Franz Liszt. She was a real gypsy, this one. And then her mother died, and her plans were halted. And she found herself elected to the role of a responsible daughter in a house full of cigar-smoking men. In other words, the cleaning woman. Her father's name was Ferdinand, and Ferdinands are always usually dynastic. At least this one was. He had his father and he had his son living under the same roof as himself. Daughters were of no consequence. So he delegated. Relegated. Well, isn't that amazing? Relegated, delegated. So he relegated to Alice the responsibilities of seeing to the domestic details. Oh, her name was Alice. Still is. She has an amazing faculty of sleeping eternally on rainy days. Ha ha! Relegated. So, Alice was living in San Francisco at the time of the earthquake. Oh, do wake up, she said. The city has been demolished. Oh, really, he said. This will give us a bloody nose in the east, and went back to sleep. The Toklas family's sense of humor was an unusually arid one, and frequently disarming. Alice was called frightening more than once. She frightened Ernest Hemingway, of all people, but that was many years later. And in those early days in San Francisco, she was quite a charming apparition. She wore Chinese silks a lot and Spanish shawls. And she rode a horse. Whenever she swept into the cafes, they used to say, "Is that you, Carmen?" She was very popular at the literary clubs. And then her grandfather died, and the earthquake happened. And Alice decided it was time to escape to someplace far away and romantic. She mentioned the idea to her neighbor, Harriet Levy, and Harriet was very encouraging about it. As a matter of fact, she offered to join her. So they booked passage on a ship and sailed to France. Alice flirted with the Commodore along the way, but it did not become successful. However, he did send her a note the day after they arrived in Paris, which she, of course, tore up and threw into the lake at the Tuileries. That night, she and Harriet paid a call on Michael and Sally Stein. I was there by chance. And that is when I first met Alice Toklas. The B is for Babette. She was immediately taken with the coral brooch I was wearing. To her, it was as if my voice emanated from it. We had tea, and I invited her to the Rue de Fleureuse the next day so we could take a walk. She arrived late by half an hour. I met her at the door, and I said, "You are late." And perhaps I did not have my friendly voice of the day before. And I paced up and down a great deal, and certain matters were made clear, very clear, very clear. "Now you understand," I said. And we took the walk. She was never late again. We walked in the Luxembourg Gardens. It was the first of our many walks there. And I pointed out all the flowers to her. "Are they not lovely, Alice?" I said. And she said, "They certainly are, Miss Stein." She was not one to take the familiar without premeditation. It was not until the following Saturday evening, when she accepted an invitation to dine at the Rue de Fleureuse, and the Picassos arrived late, that she finally became more relaxed and called me Gertrude. "Here we are, late as usual," said Fernand as she glided into the dining room as if they owned the place. And Picasso was saying, they were both talking at once, je sais, I know, punctuality is the courtesy of kings." And Aline said the next time she would fry the eggs for sure. And I said, "A cold soufflé is a cold soufflé." And Alice called me Gertrude. Leo was still sulking. We had argued earlier in the day about Plato. And who cares? He was getting to be as bad as the Duncans. Well, anyway, before you knew it, Alice had made herself quite indispensable at the Rue de Fleureuse. She was in and out a lot, running errands and doing favors for everyone. In no time at all, Harriet Levy began to get in the way. It took time to manipulate, to arrange for her to return to America, but not before the spinach supper at the Picassos, which was to become known the world over as the famous Banquet Russo. No. Alice and I were at that time going everywhere in Paris together. We had discovered in each other a mutual fondness for cakes. Cakes of all varieties. So we took in all the bakeries, and we ran into Fernand in one of them. Harriet Levy was with us, naturally. And Fernand said, "Ah, we are having a supper in honor of Rousseau." And I said, "Ah, who is Rousseau?" And she said, "Oh, it did not matter, let us see." "Yes, our names are on the list." Even Harriet Levy's. Well, as it turned out, Rousseau was a painter, and Picasso had just bought a portrait of his, a large one, and the rice supper was to be in honor of the new purchase. Well, Fernand had gone to great lengths to plan the menu and everything, but the rice was to be catered. Well, the whole thing began in the afternoon, although accounts do differ. Several of the guests had gathered earlier in the afternoon at a little cafe at the foot of the hill the Picassos lived on. We were all intent on having an aperitif before the banquet, but nobody ever stops at one. So before long, Marie Laurencin was up dancing, drunk, of course, and calling everyone by their initials. "Oh, Alice! Oh, G.A.! Oh, G.S.! Woo, woo, woo!" Well, the next to go was Harriet Levy. She got the hiccups. And just about the time we were all ready to make our way up that hill, Fernand entered the cafe and solemnly said, "Stay longer. I burned the rice. Well, we all sat back down again, except Alice, who rose to her calling, and taking charge of the crisis, she departed with Ferdinand to buy more rice. Then Apollinaire left to fetch the guest of honor, while the rest of us began to make our way up that hill. Well, Marie Laurencin did not have an easy time of it. She had the use of her legs all right, but she'd lost all sense of direction. So Leo and I exchanged her back and forth, all the way up that hill. Well, halfway up the hill, we were passed by Alice and Ferdinand, who'd found rice nowhere in the Latin Quarter, so they bought spinach instead. Well, by the time Leo and I got to the top of that hill, with what was left of Marie Laurencin, Ferdinand became abusive, really abusive, and she barred the doorway. She said, "She is not coming in here. It is not that kind of a party." And I said, "Oh, come on. We had such a terrific struggle getting her up that hill." And Ferdinand looked at me, and then she finally gave in and quietly went back to the kitchen to chop things. Then someone came rushing in to say that Apollinaire was on his way up the hill with the guest of honor, and Ferdinand put down the butcher knife, silently sat down on a chair and began to scream, because the caterers had not yet arrived with the dinner. Well, Alice calmly telephoned them, she is like that, but there was no answer. So Ferdinand said, "Forget it, we eat spinach." Well, we all sat back down again, and Apollinaire ushered in Rousseau, who was a gentle, dignified old man. "That is Rousseau," said Marie Laurencin, shocked. So Apollinaire took her over into another corner of the room and said, "This is not that kind of a party." Then Rousseau took his seat at the place of honor, which was a little throne made by Picasso, and Ferdinand came to the table and announced that there was enough spinach here to feed all of Paris. And we all clapped our hands and ate heartily and drank wine. Well, festivities continued until all hours, despite the ultimate departure of the guest of honor, who at one point merely leaned against the wall, slid to the floor, and nodded off. As a result, he missed the delirium tremens spectacle that was done so well by Kremnitz. He actually chewed a bar of soap and foamed at the mouth, which undid Alice, absolutely undid her. Horrible, she said. Then one of the candles on the wall began to drip wax onto Rousseau's head. And as the wax accumulated, it formed into a little cone. And no one dared disturb him then. Well, as the evening progressed, Max Jacob told Alice's fortune. He said she had a definite tendency toward theft. And Alice looked at me, and we conferred. And then Alice asked Max if he saw any travel in the immediate future for Harriet Levy. And Max said no. And I fixed on his eyes and said, "Try harder." Oh, I understand, he said. And then in a few minutes, Max took Harriet over into another corner of the room, where he began describing to her a psychic revelation that had swept over him concerning her. And then the donkey got into the coat room, where he proceeded to eat a telegram, a box of matches, and the feathers off Alice Toklas's hat. Alice was not amused. Well, we all finally gave out about 3 o'clock in the morning, and Leo and I put Alice and Harriet and the gentle Rousseau into a cab and took them home. Well, the next day about noon, Ferdinand and Picasso were awakened by a knock at the door. It was the caterers, of course, and they had finally arrived with the dinner. Now, you might think that was the end of the Banquet Rousseau. But it was not long before Harriet Levy took the advice of her new astrologer, Max Jacob, packed her things to return to America, and that was the end of the Banquet Rousseau. Well, here is to good old Rousseau. And everyone's inner life. Which brings me to the subject of why I left America and came to Paris. Which has a lot to do with everything. Especially identity.
American popular songs. They're as much a part of our lives as they are a part of our culture. We've danced to them, romanced to them, whistled them when we were happy, cried to them when we were sad. We've hummed them, strummed them, and fell in love to them. Now meet the men who write the songs America loves. Men like Burton Lane.
Everything I have is yours. You're part of me.
He starts with his first big hit and takes us through those golden years of stage and screen, capturing our hearts with his wit and charm.
Said I love you when you know I've been a liar all my life.
The Songwriters, a series of special programs that begins with An Evening with Burton Lane, a Kraft Music Hall presentation, Wednesday on CBS Cable.
Identity is an interesting thing. What happens to identity and memory when they are confronted with eternity? Eternity. That has always worried me. My mother was very nice and very dull. Whatever my father said was what she thought. She provided us with everything we needed. Except an interesting mother. And then she died, and we all said, well... Our father now was what one would call an authoritarian. And when he died, we were all rather relieved. Especially Leo. After the funerals, when Leo went to Harvard, I got passed around the family for a while, until they finally decided to send me to college. College. College, 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 college. Well, if she is marriageable, it will happen to her there. And if not, she will be able to get one of the better jobs and support herself. Well, I loathe that word job. I loathe the whole concept of it. To me, it meant imprisonment and my inner life being threatened, but I went to college anyway. Harvard. Well, Radcliffe, but it was Harvard. And I studied psychology with Dr. William James alongside my brother Leo. I made it to my final year in medical school, Johns Hopkins University, and would have been, oh yes, a doctor, had I never met May. Book stay over there, May had a certain quality about her that reminded me of the girls at Radcliffe, and since none of those Radcliffe girls had ever liked me, and she did, we became very close. Intimate. Americans like things to be alike. It is an art with them, if not an obsession. And anything that is different is a curiosity to them. I was going to say threats. But in America, with everything so standardized, lives, people, relationships, It is difficult to be noticeably different, and I was. I was fat, very fat, very fat. It is an interesting thing, being fat. Being fat is a state of mind. It keeps you from having to fulfill certain frightening expectations and allows you to live in a little world all of your own. Once May had lured me out of mine, I was very grateful to her and came to depend on her as I did Leo for everything. It was inconceivable to me at that time why she, that pretty little thing and almost bright too, would have dropped me for a companion who was merely less vulnerable and more sophisticated. May Bookstaver, fat being different, people politely averting their eyes. May Bookstaver, jobs, identity, senility and grandchildren and how to avoid them both. May Bookstaver, jobs, identity, father and mother and how they would have loved to have danced at my wedding. May Bookstaver in eternity. Good night, Dr. Stein. Good night, Dr. Bookstaver. Not possible. Certainly I left America, period. Years later, when Alice found the letters May had written me, she burned them. In a passion, she said. Well, Alice is like that, and sometimes her passions can be a treat. And that is very lovely. With Harriet Levy gone, Alice Stokely was free at last to accept my invitation to move into the Rue de Fleurus and become a member of the household. The year was 1909, and Leo was very accommodating about the whole thing. In fact, he gave up his study for Alice to use as her bedroom, although I think he thought that her presence at the pavilion would take the burden of producing enthusiasm for my writing off his shoulders. And perhaps, after all, he was right. Because Alice was very enthusiastic. And she had a flair for typing, quite a flair. Alice was astounded. She was astonished that my first book would have met with rejection even once, much less half a dozen times. So she said, print it yourself, Goose. Well, of course. Of course. So, 3 Lives was sent off to the Grafton Press in New York, which specialized in limited editions that were, of course, paid for out of the author's pocket. They were a little worried, the publishers, about my punctuation, which they did not consider satisfactory. So they sent a courier to Paris to discuss with me the matter of proofreading. But it is proofread, I said. Well, what about the question marks? He said, there are no question marks. And I said, question marks are out of the question. Anyone with any sense knows a question when he sees one and does not need any of those little marks to tie his shoes for him. And he said, well, surely you'll want to put in a few more commas. And then he'd look at me and quickly over at Alice and back at me again. So I finally said, yes, it is true. She is watching you very closely. After he left, Alice counted the silverware. She was not fond of publishers, no. Well, he was not about to leave until I agreed to put in at least one more comma. So I said, put in another comma, you out of your mind, period. We followed him to the courtyard, laughing and shouting about epistrophic contractions and the evils thereof. Well, by the autumn of 1911, I had finished my second book, my 1,000-page book, and it was long. And Alice typed every one of the pages herself. And it was long. it was now no longer the history of a family. It had somehow become the history of everybody. Well, there were so many pages to fill. For Leo, the making of Americans was about 999 pages too long. Leo was always so much more adventuresome when we were younger. How did he get to be so staid? I was always the shy one, but as we grew older, it seemed odd how our roles seemed almost to reverse. I was no longer following. He was no longer leading. Very strange, very. And analysis was what did it to him. He was never successful at shaping his character around his limitations once he had identified them. He could not accept his limitations, much less learn to love them. And that is a very important key to being an artist. Creating is a funny thing. A book is you make it. And you make it for yourself, and you make it for strangers. And you want to show it to everyone. And you're afraid to show it to anyone. And then someone looks at it and reads it. And you wonder if they will say yes or no. Yes is what you want, of course. It is always very pleasant, yes. But no is what every writer, every artist is afraid of. As for Alice, she gathered up and typed every day what I'd written down the night before. And later we would take tea and read through the pages together. Always quite surprised by what we found, because it was all done rather spontaneously. As time passed, we took to referring to it as the daily miracle. It was quite a ritual with us. Alice. Alice was my yes. And that was very important. So, Alice and I decided to go off to Spain together. And we created a sensation in our clothes. Alice always carried her fan and wore black. My Spanish disguise, she said. I wore my robe and sandals. The villagers followed me everywhere. They thought I was a bishop. Well, it was interesting. It was interesting. I discovered, while we were there in Spain together, I have an amazing faculty for creating new languages when the ones that are present do not do. And in Spain, English and French do not do. So, not knowing any Spanish, I had to improvise. And the villagers seemed to understand me. At least they looked like they did. So I was able to experiment with the sounds of words rather than definitions, with textures instead of meanings. And I came up with some incredible new combinations. So Spain proved to be for me as it was for Picasso, a place of inspiration. With this new style, and it was totally disarming, it really was, I was able to create word portraits of people I know. I did Matisse, I did Picasso. But the first of them was Alice. I called it Ada, but it was Alice. I showed it to her. Baffling, she said. Wonderful, I said. And then we went off to Italy, to Mabel Dodge's villa just outside Florence. And that is where it happened. My brother made me angry, an opera. We spent the autumn there. Leo joined us. And I wrote the portrait of Mabel Dodge at the Villa Coronia. in my newly discovered style, which Mabel had published at her own expense and bound in Florentine wallpaper. Leo was incensed. He felt that my portrait of Mabel was not only obscure, but a hoax, an elaborate hoax. Well, I was furious. Then he wrote a sarcastic parody of Mabel's portrait, which I pretended to understand, which made him even angrier. Until he finally confided in Mabel that he felt I was growing foolish and helpless. In his opinion, because of Alice. He said she did everything to save me a step. He said it was a clear case of the weaker enslaving the stronger. He said he had seen trees choked to death by vines in the same fashion. Yes, the noun was vines and the verb was choked. Well, when Mabel told me that, I laughed. Said that that was the way I felt about the use of commas. But inside it made me feel funny that he saw Alice in that light. It made me feel funny, and Alice sensed it too. Well, by the end of the autumn, when we returned to the Road of Fleurus, everything came out into the open. To begin with, Leo stopped associating himself with the Saturday evenings altogether. He said he was no longer able to endure talking art with just anyone who happened in. He would rather cope with demons. Then one night, when everyone was gone, or gone to bed, "I want to talk to you," he said. "Well," I said. And that was the beginning of Act 4. "Gertrude," he said, "Cubism is tommy rot. Whether it is done with a paintbrush or a fountain pen, it is tommy rot. Tommy rot, tommy rot, tommy rot. Tommy rot." Well, I had to sit down after that. "And as for Picasso's latest works," he continued, "they're, for my money, utterly obnoxious. Someone asked me the other day if I do not think them quite mad, and I said pitifully, no, they're not that intriguing at all, just stupid." He said that. He actually said that. And then he accused me. I suppose he wanted me to confess. He said, "Gertrude, it is quite obvious that you are not interested in the criticism of ideas." I said, "Go on." And he said, "Well, that is a clear case that your main interests lie in the pursuit of glory." And I said, "Hold it right there." And he said, "No, it is true. You've always desired glory from life. As far back as 1902, you were verbose about it. Walking along the Grand Canal, you kept repeating it over and over. Glory, la gloire, la gloire." And I said, "So what?" And he said, "Gertrude, that is vain." I said, "All right, vain, so?" He said, "Gertrude, there is no room in art for vanity." And I said, "Wait a minute, quattrocento art expert." Well, he looked at me as though I'd stabbed him. I said, "Leo, what about Michelangelo? What about Leonardo? What about Titian with his thing for red hair? You trying to tell me those boys were above vanity?" Well, he looked at me, but he said nothing. I said, "Leo, glory, la gloire is very pretty, yes. But it is just a mere tool." He said, "Oh, this ought to prove interesting." I said, "Leo, in order to gain a foothold, in order to gather a following, you have to do the things you have to do that get you an audience. Then, once you have them, listeners, readers, spectators, you become responsible to them. You have to. They become your children then, and that is a responsibility. You are obliged to them. Because they care about what you think in order to dare to think new thoughts of their own. And he said, the responsibility, little mother, ought to come first and not after. Well, I was absolutely speechless then. And then his eyes sort of dilated, and he said, sort of smiling, let me dichotomize la gloire for you. And then I found my eyes dilating, and I found I was speechless no more, and I said, oh, by all means do. And he said, in 2 words, I like the term publish. Gertrude, that holds a certain dignity for me. And you like the term publicity. And I said, what difference? Publish, publicity, what difference really? I mean, they both have that pub. They both have that pub. He said, oh, hell, you give me nonsense. I said, if that is nonsense, then I'm someone else, someone else, someone else. And he always hated when I did that. Well, dust settles. And then I said, finally, it is not a matter of responsibility and timing then. Finally, it is a matter of some people feeling that they are expected by the world to share what they think by the whole world, and some people feeling that the world ought to expect them to share what they think. And he said, is that the way you think it is with you and me? And I said, what do you think? And he said, Gertrude, remember when you were a little girl? And I knew it was going to be long then. And I said, yes. He said, remember going to school and how you were obliged to enter an art contest? And I remembered. I remembered. Because ever since I've considered competition to be not interesting. Well, competition, allowing it to happen naturally, is one thing. But in America, from kindergarten all the way up to the first heart attack, they encourage it. And with special emphasis on winning. And oh, they do love their competitive sports. Especially the arena, the actual arena, the stadium. You would think it would be the Italians being descended from the Romans, but no. The only ones who love the stadium more than the Americans are the Spaniards. Oh, the Germans like the bullfights too, but as Pablo always said, with the Spaniards it is the ritual, and with the Germans it is the bloodshed. What got me off on this? Oh. Leo telling me about when I was a little girl going to school. So I said, Leo, what has this got to do with anything? And he said, oh, I'll show you. He said, remember coming home from school that day and how your brothers all sat you down and tried to show you how to take a cup and saucer in front of you and draw its outline on paper? And you were incapable totally of grasping that. Totally froze your mind. I said, yes. He said, that carried over into medical school, did it not? You weren't able to draw anatomical studies. You could not for the life of you grasp how to take a real shape and depict its concavities and convexities on paper. I said, yes. He said, you never really ever learned how to draw a paragraph either, did you? How to construct one. And I said, no. I have these limitations. And then he said, Gertrude, who finally took and drew the cup and saucer for you, which you then took back to school with you and won the prize? And I said, you did, Leo. And he said, that is just about what you did with art, Gertrude, with cubism. I did it all for you, and you went out and won the prize. And lost it while playing in a field on the way home from school. And that, he said, is very Freudian. And I said, you are very Freudian. And then he said he felt cheated somehow. And I said, oh. Identity is a funny thing when it is threatened. It is odd that we both would have become a threat to one another's inner lives by our very existences. I do not know why it was that way, but it was that way. And he knew that it was. Well, it just was. And then he said, you and Picasso have both gone off into your so-called abstract tangents, and no one understands what you are doing or trying to do. Your artistic abilities are, I think, extremely limited. And then he attacked my book, my 1,000-page book. He said that my mind was as little nimble as any mind could be, and that my latest efforts to emulate Picasso's newest forms of my writing were not only affected, but pathetically comical. So I rose and said, is that all? And he said, no, and I sat back down again. And then he said that he had talked to Picasso recently about art, he said, and that Picasso had finally come to the realization that although art should be instinctive, it should be developed and filtered through the intellect of the artist. Oh, he knew how to use your favorite idols, Leo, when he was setting you up for something. And then he said, you and Picasso are both using a pair of intellects which you ain't got, in order to do that which requires the sharpest critical aplomb which you ain't got neither, in order to turn out not just mediocre stuff, but the most God almighty trash imaginable. He said, better to produce nothing, my dear, than to produce garbage. Well, I left the room then. And I decided before I went to sleep that night that it was quite obviously time for brother and sister to part. Dividing up of the great Stein collection came as a shock to everyone, but it was done pleasantly enough. Leo took his portion of the Renaissance furniture and the Cezanne apples. Picasso painted this apple for Alice and me to take its place. And the rest, we just sort of divided up equally. Late in the spring, Leo wrote from his new home in Florence, saying he hoped we would all live happily ever afterwards, sucking contentedly on our separate oranges. We had been friends for a long time, he and I. He'd been my companion for over 40 years. Little by little after that, we never saw each other or wrote or spoke. Sometimes when I think about it, Anyway, gradually, after that, it was just Alice and myself together alone at the pavilion. Rather peaceful. We still held the receptions on Saturday evenings. Alice fixed things for everyone to eat. She was awfully good at that. No one ever turned down anything she made. Except that fudge. And then my little Carl Van Vechten began dropping over. We had met briefly at the theater, and we became great friends. In rapid time, we became almost a middle-class family. Carl was Papa Woodrums, Alice was Mama Woodrums, and as for Baby Woodrums, I'd rather not think about that right now. And then the Germans invaded Belgium and war was declared. War. In my lifetime. Just because the politicians in one country were mad at the politicians in another country. Well, politicians can be damned uninteresting at times. And war is such an uninteresting thing. It really is. Well, after the war, a lot of American writers were coming to Paris to meet me. Some of them expatriates like myself. Oh, America was still my country. But Paris was my hometown. And these writers were all looking for something, and I had it, and they knew it, and they wanted it. And they all wanted to meet me. So they gathered over at Sylvia Beach's bookshop, each one of them imploring her introduction to me. Well, Sylvia could never say no to Scott Fitzgerald. So we met Scotty and his wife. Yes, he made the mistake of bringing his wife to the Rue de Fleurus. Oh, wives bother me. They bore me, they bore me, they bore me stiff. But since they could not actually be stopped from coming once there, they were snatched aside and kept out of the way by Alice. Oh, she was awfully good at it. Frighteningly so. Oh, she was such a little cat, Alice. But her favorite mouse was Hemingway's wife. Now, the Hemingways were too happily married to be believed. Her name was Hadley, and, oh, my goodness, they were young. Oh, he was 23, Ernest, and they were both a little afraid of Alice. Well, Hemingway was a mass of fear and prejudices in those days. But I was patient with him. I mean, he was so young, and his eyes were so passionately interested. And he sat at my feet as though I were the goddess of intelligence. So, I proceeded to instruct him on the subject of sex. Well, after a short time, after it all sunk in, he sent me a very brief note that said, "A bitch is a bitch is a bitch." And it was signed, "Your pal." So I knew he understood then, and nothing more needed to be said. Well, I liked him then, you know, Hemingway, when he was a young fella. And I thought that some of his really early stuff was not too bad, but he and Alice never got along, so our friendship did not last. It faded. But not the flowers of it. Never the flowers. Well, another friendship that faded fast was my friendship with Sylvia Beach. She, Sylvia, actually published a signed limited edition of James Joyce's Ulysses. Now, Joyce was a name that was never mentioned at the Rue de Fleurus. He was a traitor, that boy. He had that magnificent, beautiful stream of consciousness right at his fingertips. And he opted for clarity. But she published him. Sylvia signed, limited at that. So Alice and I finally decided to transfer our patronage to another bookshop on the right bank. And when Sylvia confronted me with this and asked me why, I told her. And she said I was beginning to sound an awful lot like that brother of mine I'd told her about. Well, that was not to be taken lightly. I gave that a great deal of thought, and then in rather a mournful gesture, I went home and cut off all my hair. Well, not really all of it, but most of it. And then I just gradually lost interest in Sylvia's remarks. I just forgot about them. And I became involved in writing a bestseller, my first one. I had often asked Alice why she did not write an autobiography. She had surely led a fascinating life, and she could call it my 25 years with a genius or something. And Alice said, with everything else I have to do, you want me to write books as well? Do not be a goose. So I wrote it for her, her autobiography, Alice's. The Autobiography of Alice B. Toklas by Gertrude Stein. And it became very popular very fast, especially in America. But in Paris, a group was formed to protest its publication, charging me with a heavy list of discrepancies and accusing me of indiscretions. You would have thought I'd told on them or something. There was even a rumble from Italy, the land of Quattrocento art. Lear was obviously wounded because I'd not used him as a character in the book, nor was he even mentioned by name. He was simply referred to as Gertrude Stein's brother. Justice is a dessert best served with a slight chill to it. Oh, nothing could have infuriated Leo more than to know that a book that I had written in 6 weeks had made me a famous celebrity in both Europe and America. Yes, famous. Oh, becoming a celebrity is an interesting thing. At least it was until the writing stopped. My writing stopped. I could not tell anyone, not even Alice, but when it stopped, and I knew it immediately inside. Only Papa Woodrum seemed to sense something. Carl, he seemed to know something was wrong. And he said, Woodrums, baby Woodrums, it is time. For what? For you to confront your lionhood. Really, do you think so? Yes. The great American lecture tour at all the universities in 1934, when I was 58 years old and had just begun my lionhood, by Gertrude. Gertrude Stein. Auditoriums, trains, planes, lecture halls, coughs. Someone whispers and silence. America was amazing. It had grown so, and everywhere they were glad to see me. And Carl got me, with a little help from Alice, in an airplane. And we flew in the air. We actually flew in the air. Oh, what a miracle that is. It makes the ground below look like cubism. And my writing stopped. And we flew to Chicago, and there we attended an all-black performance of an opera of mine Virgil Thompson had written the music for. 4 saints in 3 acts. And my writing stopped. And after the last lecture, before we returned home, Alice and I were invited to meet the Mr. Bennett Cerf of the Random House Publishing Company in New York, which turned out to be one of the most thrilling of all of our experiences there. And my writing stopped. But when we finally got to New York, we got upstairs there to talk with Bennett Cerf, and we talked about everything from cubism to mystery stories. And I told him about my predilection for mystery stories. I could read a mystery story a day for the rest of my life. I love mystery stories. Everything is a mystery story. Sitting, doing nothing. Thinking is a mystery story. Will she go and wake Alice up, or will Alice have to sleep forever? Everything is a mystery story. And then Bennett Cerf said that he would publish a book of mine a year for the next 4 years. Well, Alice was ecstatic. But inside I said, oh, wonderful. Now that the writing has stopped. And then we returned to Paris, and whom should we bump into when we first got there but Fernand Olivier and Marie Laurencin. And that was the beginning of the final act. Fernand was in a fit, and Marie Laurencin was just sort of green-colored. What is it, I said. And Fernand said, oh, Riddle. Then she burst into tears, and Marie Laurencin had to explain then. She said that Picasso had taken up with a bunch of surrealists who were then presently in vogue. And I said, well, yes, he likes to be voguish. But, she said, he has abandoned his wife, Olga. And I said, well, he's done that sort of thing before. Fernand, remember when he left you for the new Mistress Eve and left the Bateau Lavoir? Yes, he's done that sort of thing before, eh? But, she said, he has given up painting and taken to writing poetry. And I said, ha! He's done what? I said, wait a minute, writing is mine. Well, it was true. Painting was his and writing was mine. And it wasn't funny at all. So, Alice and I decided to look into this matter further. And we even paid a visit to Picasso. I took along my eyeglasses so I could read some of his stuff. Oh, dear. I love Pablo. He will always be my friend. But he has never felt a single thing with words in his entire life. Words are definitely not his métier. But I knew I had to say something, so I took a deep breath and said, lovely handwriting. And then he knew. So I said, well, then, now, let us discuss painting. And he said, let us not. I'm a man of letters now. I do not paint, I go to cafes. Well, some time passed, and he continued writing. And then one day, he called and asked if he might bring a friend to dinner. And Alice said, who is the friend? And he said, Salvador Dali. And she said, well, I guess so. But with Picasso and dinner, one could never be quite sure. And as I should have suspected, the Dali showed up, and he did not. He'd sent them over to find out what I really thought. Well, Salvador had written a poem about Picasso. And he said that Picasso's poetry had made him understand Picasso's paintings even more. And I said, oh, really? And then I took him apart piece by piece and deposited him on the doorstep. Well, a little time later, I was walking on the street, and Picasso saw me, and he beckoned me over, and he said, why could you tell Dali and not me? And I said, because Dali is Dali, and you are sensible. He needed to know, and you already do. And he said, what do I know? And I said that you are not a poet. And he said, suppose I do. Well, then, I just shook him by his lapels. I mean, sometimes you have to bully people, and I did. I just shook him hard by his lapels. And I said, so do not try to get me to tell you that you are something that you are not. And he said, what am I then? I said, you are the Picasso, the phoenix of the 20th century. And he said, what will I do? I said, you will paint beautiful pictures, and I will do the writing. And then I kissed him, and his face turned red, and he smiled. And he said, oh, Gertrude, you know me. And I said, yes. And then he kissed me. And inside Vola's, Fernand Olivier and Marie Laurencin were watching and laughing and crying and hugging each other. Well, I began to write again. Yes, I began to write again. This time, everybody's autobiography. Absolutely everybody's autobiography. We were all much older by then. In many ways, we'd all changed. The world had changed. Only Leo had remained the same. And Leo. The day I mailed the manuscript to Random House, I saw him on the street. We did not speak. We merely nodded. And I came home then and wrote a strange thing called How She Bowed to Her Brother. He went home and wrote me a letter. Yes, I received it yesterday. I do not know whether I will write him back or not. There are moments when I think I should. As good Professor James used to say in his lectures at Harvard, those marvelous ones, always keep a little window open in the attic. Always. Not cracked. Open. Which brings me back to something I was thinking about earlier. I thought I'd lost it for sure. What happens to identity and memory when they are confronted with eternity? I remember seeing my first comet when I was young, my first real one. How it both thrilled and frightened me. Because it made me realize there are big things going on out there. And my little identity and my little memory seemed pretty little. And it made me wonder. But I never speculate on answers, though. Besides, how would you know if you ever came up with the right ones? Who would tell you? No. No. The most important thing is coming up with the questions. The questions. It just is. Well, I was depressed thinking about all of this, and then this morning Alice woke up and she was depressed. She said she'd had a dream. What if you're the first to go, Gertrude? What will I do alone? And I said, there are no answers, only questions. And then Alice said that she was considering converting to Roman Catholicism, and I said, wait until I'm dead to do it. And then the landlord came, and his son is moving in tomorrow, and he left. And it started to rain, and Alice went back to sleep. Ah, the sun is out. Must have stopped raining some time ago. Oh, Alice is going to kill me. Nothing has been packed. Well, I'd better get her up. Wood arms! Mama, wood arms! Still and all, it does not seem right or possible to decimate these walls. been our home. This is not just an address, it is like an entity. We made this place into an international shrine for modern art. We moved out an old century from these rooms and moved in another. Well then, for people like that, it should not be so difficult memorizing a new address. Woodjams! Mama Woodjams! There. Now that I've said goodbye to this old place, I do not suppose it would hurt to send a note to Italy informing Leo to mail further correspondence, if any, to number 5. Number 5 what? Number 5 Rue Christine. Oh, this will get him. Number 5 Rue Christine. Rue Christine. Rue Christine.